Hey guys, thanks for showing up to the first video where we take viewer questions and we actually answer them in a way that hopefully they can help everybody involved. The question we're looking at today is actually a doozy. It's a little outside of my professional wheelhouse, so I had to do quite a bit of research, but I was very interested once I was thinking through the tax aspects of it, how it actually worked in general. I think we got a good answer here, so let's get into it. The question we're talking about today comes from one of my friends actually, who was kind enough to send in an issue he was dealing with his family. Essentially I'll just read the question. The question submitted was, my aunt is setting up a trust to help her and my uncle manage assisted living and home health care expenses potentially. When she was explaining it to me, I don't think either of us were quite sure how it actually worked. Now, some important context, I know that what he's dealing with is called an irrevocable living trust. That is something that can essentially protect your assets from taxation if you do it right, and in this case, can help you afford elderly care. That's what we're going to be looking at here. The strategy at hand is the protection of assets from Medicaid lookbacks using an irrevocable living trust, as I just mentioned. This, again, is going to help you if you do it within the rules. You can put assets that, when you put it into an irrevocable living trust, you lose access to those assets, so it requires some very specific planning, but what you can do is protect it from tax impacts, allowing those assets or whatever's in that trust to grow and be protected from the IRS and any other weird creditor things happening like that. Structured properly and with the right timing, this makes Medicaid qualification easier and avoids the ability of Medicaid to recover costs from you by taking from your assets. Kind of what we just explained, right? But by doing this, you can avoid them coming after not only the taxes, but in this specific scenario, what you're applying for is Medicaid assistance, right? Instead of pulling from your assets, your cash balances, whatever it may be, stuff you want to leave to future generations, you are able to use a vehicle like this so that you are able to qualify for something like Medicaid within the rules, right? If you have a bunch of money, Medicaid's going to want to look at that. They're going to expect you to pay for your own care. Through this strategy, you're able to work around that a little bit. Let's dive further into it. The key players we're talking about in this type of situation, Medicaid. Simple definition here, Medicaid is a joint federal state program that helps cover medical costs for people with limited income and resources. So again, that's the importance behind getting the resources, the assets out of your control. It's going to allow you to apply for this type of assistance. The irrevocable living trust is the other key player here, described previously, but this is a legal arrangement where assets are transferred to a trustee for the benefit of the beneficiaries, and the grantor cannot revoke or change the terms of the trust after its creation. Very important point, because the key thing that's happening is you're giving up control of the assets that you have in order to make this work. It's a key function of this whole thing. They don't want you can't put it in a trust and also pull from that same asset pile. You have to say, I'm not touching that anymore, put it in that irrevocable living trust, and that's the mechanism by which this can start to work. But it's very important to know that once you place your assets in an IRT, you will lose control of those assets. Again, very important part of the planning aspect of this when you're working with a professional who's specifically geared to help with this. Now, the challenges we want to be looking at. The big one is the Medicaid 5-year look-back rule. So you're doing all this, you're doing it to get Medicaid assistance so you do not have to pull from your assets again, right? You want to preserve those assets for future generations, whoever it may be going to, your heirs. You want to keep that intact. That's why you're doing this. The Medicaid 5-year look-back rule is going to take a look at those assets that have been being transferred. So let's look at that definition we have here. The time frame, 60 months, during which Medicaid reviews an applicant's financial transactions to assess asset transfers made before applying for long-term care benefits. That's the big guy. So again, the 5-year look-back rule is going to take 5 years and look, did you transfer money into a trust? Did you transfer money to individuals? Did you gift a bunch of money to grandkids or something like that? All those types of things are going to likely apply to this 5-year look-back rule. Again, why planning is so important. You don't want to be making, you're still going to need money, right? Even if you're going with a strategy like this. So you need to make sure that anytime you're moving money around or transferring money, you're keenly aware of the implications and that you're working within the rules within this 5-year look-back, right? You can't get caught with your pants down or something is going to happen that's going to throw this plan off track. And if that happens and you lose access to the Medicaid assistance, what was it for, right? So again, the planning aspect, key. I'm going to continue to mention it. Transfers within the 5-year look-back period will likely trigger penalties and delays in benefits, just described, right? You gotta mind the 5-year look-back rule. You can't be moving a bunch of money around, getting rid of money for this purpose. It has to be done very specifically, a key aspect of the strategy. Now, loss of asset control, I'll spare you there. We've talked about that. Placing your assets in an IRT causes you to lose control. You cannot access these once they have been transferred, as mentioned. Big part of the planning, make sure you know that you're not going to need it. Obviously, with the elderly care aspect, you're moving into some sort of assisted living or something like that. That's the whole point. You aren't going to need those assets anymore. That's why you've made this decision, but there's still some key planning aspects that have to be just done absolutely right. Let's run through a quick demonstration using mathematics, if you will, to demonstrate essentially how this works, like at a very high level. This is lacking a lot of details, but it should show you how the money will move and the timing that we can use. Basically, let's say you start with $5 million in assets. The important part, step 2 here, is that you're planning for your elderly care. You need to, because of the 5-year look-back rule, you need to be planning well outside of 5 years to make sure you can get these things done. Make sure you don't need any money you're going to be transferring, whatever it may be. It just requires a very tight plan and something that you're aware how it works. You can't be unsure and do little things that are going to jeopardize you. Now, step 3, you open that irrevocable trust after you've done the planning, so you know the right timing to do it. You're going to open that trust, and you're going to take, whatever it may be. In this example, we have $5 million in assets. We're going to transfer $4.5 million into that irrevocable trust. What does that do? It protects that money, as we've described, from those Medicaid lookbacks. If you do it right, it's going to protect the assets from Medicaid coming after them to fund, again, your assistance. So you would qualify for the Medicaid assistance that wouldn't come out of your own pocket. With elderly care, very expensive, very important to make sure you have a plan for this type of stuff if you think you're going to be in that situation. And then you can see here, we have $500,000 left. We got $4.5 million in the trust itself. You got $500,000. Again, this will be part of your plan, planning for the expenses you have, any taxes you want to pay on behalf of your trust, but you're going to leave some sort of asset in your control so you can have money to live still. 5 years past, that look back period is satisfied, and your trust assets are protected for your heirs, and you're able to meet the income and asset thresholds, that you also get that Medicaid assistance. So that's kind of the very high level aspect of the plan, how the money would move and at what time within it. If you did not protect your assets this way, as we see here at the bottom, elderly care can be very expensive, as mentioned many times in this video. You will pay a lot out of pocket if you do anything above the minimum, Medicare type of situation. And those costs are going to be paid using the assets in your estate. They'll say, whether you need to sell something or they're going to pull from your cash accounts, they will pay for that care using your assets unless you do something like this to avoid that. And that ultimately that will end up depleting, what you're saving for your heirs. So just make sure you're planning ahead. Make sure you have a general understanding of how this works, and hopefully this mathematical, display will help you do that. So within the challenges we have, how can we make this work? The big one, IRT transfers occur greater than 5 years before you are forecasted needing living Medicaid. So we have a couple key items in there: the transfers happening within the outside the 5-year look back period, and the forecasting aspect. So again, if we're talking about 5 years where you have had to have done this, you need to be doing very specific forecasting in terms of the plan you have in place and how it's going to be executed, because putting these things in place takes time, right? You need to make sure you're giving yourself the time to do it. After 5 years, outside the look back period where Medicaid recover costs of your plan from your assets, great. You do that, that's the big thing. You're going to be outside that 5-year period, and now you're going to qualify for that Medicaid assistance you're looking for. The income and asset levels you're going to be within, and you're going to be able to get the assistance again without pulling from your state to cover your elderly care costs. And then you want to mind your uncountable assets from spousal protection. So as we're talking about asset transfers, there are some things that seem to be protected by the rules of Medicaid, like your personal home, a personal vehicle, and personal belongings. They're not going to come after, your jewelry, perhaps, unless you're some sort of jewelry dealer or something like that. But they're not going to come after your personal belongings like that. They're not going to expect that you put all those into the trust. But if you're holding retirement accounts, you're holding cash, you're holding money and stuff like that, or real estate, anything you want protected that's like that, got to be in that trust, right? Otherwise, they are going to look at that and they're going to pull from that to pay for your living assistance. A few other considerations just to be aware of. You need to be working with an elder law attorney, absolutely paramount. You can't try to execute something like this on your own without messing things up. There's just too many rules to be worried about. Mind your state. There's state-specific Medicaid rules. Almost all of them have their own individual rules in some way. Again, we've talked about how it's a federal and state combined program. That's important. It's important to make sure you're minding those rules. Again, your professional should be very in tune with those. Tax liabilities. This specific one came up within the example my friend sent me. In this situation, they are paying taxes on behalf of their trust so that the trust assets can grow tax-free. So that's another little wrinkle of the strategy that we're talking about here, is that essentially once the trust exists, you and your trust are separate. You are still allowed to pay the taxes that trust might incur, because the trust is responsible for paying taxes as well if it has income-producing components. If you are paying the taxes on behalf of the trust, essentially that trust is allowed to grow, without it being touched, without the assets coming out of that plan to pay for those taxes. And then just one more reminder, be careful of any gifts. Again, this seems like somewhere where it might be easy to trip up. You give your grandson 20 grand because you just got it available. You don't know what you're going to do with it. If you're in that 5-year look back period, that's going to be something that could trigger some of those penalties and delays. You just need to be mindful of any transfer of money in that 5-year look back period. Can't be stated enough. So what's the bottom line here? This can be an incredibly useful strategy to qualify for Medicaid while also preserving the value of your assets for your heirs, using that Medicaid funding that you qualify for through this process to effectively not use your assets to pay for your care. That can be, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, depending on what type of facility you're doing, what type of care you're getting. Very, very powerful strategy there. You got to utilize professional help. No doubt, we've mentioned that a couple times. Make sure you're working with somebody who this is their profession, and make sure you're working ahead of time. 5-year look back period. Can't be said enough. So important. Make sure you're on top of that stuff. You're not doing little things that could jeopardize the state of your assistance or the quality or the timing that you're going to get it. You don't want any delays. You don't want any penalties. Make sure that stuff on track. Stay in tune with your plan. It's going to give you the opportunity to do these things without having to worry about breaking important rules that could jeopardize everything. So thanks for joining me on that one. I hope that was helpful. It was insightful to me to learn more about it. Hopefully you get some insight out of this, and this is something you can take to a family member, or if you're in that position, you can take it and use when the time is right.